All right, congrats for making it this far. That was a lot of stuff. These ideas that we've covered so far, variables, conditionals, iteration and loops and functions, these are so foundational to all the stuff that we're going to be doing with code throughout the semester and in many other programming languages as well. The homework this week is about then taking those ideas and trying to make something really cool with them. Specifically, you're going to be making quilts in code. Quilts, I think, are truly amazing. They have a really rich history in America and across the world in all kinds of cultures, and they really embody a lot of the ideas of what we're talking about. This idea of iteration and repetition. If we look at this example here, this is by a quilt maker named Barbara Yoder, and this is a traditional pattern, but we can see here, you start to see these things in real life. I'm seeing two-dimensional iteration in this grid here. I'm seeing push matrix, matrix transformations where it's drawing repeating patterns within local regions. And that's really the idea here. So your homework, you're going to be looking at traditional quilt patterns and other things that inspire, that are similar, and making some drawings, then doing some sketching in code. And then a week from now, you're going to be then refining that sketch and finishing up your own quilt. So let's talk through what's happening here. Essentially, this is a 2-week assignment, so you're going to be doing some initial drawings and some work, and then in 2 weeks, the final version is due. Your sketch is going to be 600 by 600 again, or resizable with the browser, and we'll talk about how you're going to turn that stuff in. Oh, and we already talked about a lot of this stuff, but the idea is, you're going to take the power of this repeating structure and make something really cool. The goal is not, I think this is really important to say, your goal is not to just replicate an existing traditional pattern, but to be inspired by them and make your own thing. And another thing for you to think about is what kind of quilt or textile pattern is possible through code that would be impossible otherwise. So something with 1 million or 10 million pieces or all kinds of other cool stuff. We're going to come back around to what's due in a little bit. And if you scroll way down, there's a bunch of resources here that I think are really great and is going to be where you're going to start with this assignment. None of us make in a vacuum. Making really is part of a long heritage. We looked at some examples of folks doing programming and art back in the 60s and 70s, people like Vera Molnar and Manfred Moore, who are really kind of like important early figures in the field. But we can also see that we're not just having to look at artists working with code or computers. We can be inspired by all kinds of different things. So I want to show you some examples. Oh, if you go in this week's images folder on GitHub, you'll find most of these here. I'm not going to go through everything because there's just a ton, but that's a great place that you can go reference. Let's start with American quilts in the United States. So there's a long and really interesting history. And if you want, I highly recommend spending some time in researching this, but especially for African Americans, this quilting tradition has been a hugely important part of that culture in the US and has been passed down in families and in communities. And these things are just amazing. So these are all made by hand. So obviously they're, and I love the kind of like, this is where something we really see. We see the rigidity of the pixel versus this kind of like material flowing sort of, thing from the fabric being pulled and maybe not cut quite perfect and things like that. I really love this. If this is something you want to play with in your own algorithmic quilt, like how to bring that to it, I think that's really cool. Some of these quilts we know the makers of. So this is a quilt by R.B. Williams from 1987. This is a much more recent one. But we also know that it was quilted, and quilting is the stitching that goes in between or along the seams of these sections. It was quilted by another person, Willia Etta Graham, and it's a very time-consuming and a skilled process. So you may see some examples like that. But I love these. This is one by Gladys Henry. The color in these is super intense. The found materials, the patterns, these things are just incredible. It's from 1975, Minnie Nobles. So pattern nested in pattern in pattern. There's an overall kind of composition, but then these things are almost like fractals where they're like self-similar at different scales. Really cool. So you could start thinking about ways you could incorporate some of the visual ideas that you're seeing here. So many different ones. And then Rosie Lee Tompkins, there's a great article in the New York Times that I have a link to for you. She's a contemporary quilt maker. And these are all some of her many, many, many quilts. And these are really amazing. These also very much engage politics and what it's like to be a Black American. And I think this is a really interesting thing too. We see that this work is not made in a vacuum. And even though it's very pattern and geometric, there's a connection to one's place in the culture that's evidenced through these. I think is really cool. So lots of examples. I encourage you to spend some real time with these. These are really great. What else did we want to look at? Let's look at some other quilts. So I have a whole bunch of more examples. And let's just go through some of these. So this is from 1865. This is this like cubic sort of design, but it's called an autograph quilt where someone would sign each one of these sections. I don't know if they donate the fabric that goes into them, but I love that richness. So we see this like big pattern and a smaller, more detailed pattern with variation. Oh, these are some of my favorite. This is called a whole cloth quilt. So rather than be made of pieces of fabric sewn together, this is one big piece of fabric that's just stitched into to make that pattern. I love this like monochrome. There's so much detail here. This is in the assignment. It's the full quilt. Some of these are a little smaller than others. So then there's lots of, it's not going to cooperate. There we go. So there's quilts are found all over the world. This is from West Bengal and India. We're just going to go through some of these. This is unknown. Again, seemingly simple pattern that repeats and creates this crazy optical illusion thing. This is another Indian quilt. Gujarat. I'm going to zip through these. You should spend some time in the folder taking a look. There's some really, really cool stuff. This is Hmong, Iran. Yeah, like the contrast of texture here is really great. Bhutan. Sorry, some of these are kind of small. Oh, Nigeria, of course. Pakistan. I've put a link. Oh, this is so great too. Like you feel it's both like a drawing and a painting, and you could start seeing how to make this in code, but also like it's not all perfect and it just like breaks your eyes in this really great way. I've put a link to the Quilt Study Center, the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska. They have an amazing online collection. That's where a lot of these are from. Oh, and then here's some women in Kansas in the 1920s quilting together. Quilting is very much in some cultures a social activity. You come together, collaborative. And obviously, in at least the early history of this, it's mostly women doing this work. And so there's, I think, also something really interesting to think about this in the context of a very male, white male dominated thing like computer programming. Let's see, what else do we want to look at? Oh, other textiles. So we're not limited to just thinking about quilts. And the Bauhaus was a really important school and place for artists and designers and craftspeople in the early 20th century in Germany. And many of those folks fled during World War II to the United States. And Annie Albers is one of the founders of this and is really incredible weaver. So this is one of her pieces from 1947. Some of these are very, very big. Some are really small. But her use of pattern and material is really incredible, and she's hugely influential. This is Gertrude Arndt. And one of the things for the Bauhaus was seeing craft, things like weaving and textiles, as being equally valid, equally meaningful and important as more traditional things like painting and sculpture. So there's a bunch of, this is a study for one of those pieces. And again, like you just see code in this, don't you? I love it. So lots more there. What else do I want to show you? Islamic Tile, of course, we could spend ages talking about tile work in the Islamic world. Um, Incredibly intricate, mathematically inspired patterns. This is in Morocco. The repetition here is much more complicated. This is the Alhambra in Spain. If you get a chance to go, this place is insane. It's completely covered, every surface, with decoration like this. It's gorgeous. This is a painting from some, some of these things are lost. This is a specific kind of tile work in Iran. This is also in the Alhambra. These are like these scalloped, intersecting kind of tile, three-dimensional tile shapes. Bananas. Iran, so cool. Color, pattern, mathematics, geometry, all together. Really great. So you can take a look at those. Other math-related things, obviously patterning and tiling is a big idea in math. These are a few Penrose tile. Oh, this is a bismuth crystal. It grows like this. Bananas. I love it. Crystal structure in the microscope, more tiling. And a lot of this you find in Islamic tile as well. Like I said, we're not going to go through everything here. I did also want to show you, of course, someone like MC Escher is someone that comes to mind when you think about iteration and pattern. So these are his tessellations, where you can see these shapes all nesting into this repeating thing. I don't know how anyone's brain thinks of these or figures these out. I love them. Oh, well, we don't have time to go through all this. This is some Ukrainian embroidery, also so great. Again, you could imagine doing this in code. These are really cool. I'm going to just zip through this. I want to show you two other contemporary artists then who are picking up some of these ideas. So this is Peter Halley, who's a painter. This is from 2017. He's working today. These are very large abstract paintings, but in them, he's thinking about, so at first they just seem like shapes. And in many ways, that is what we're seeing. But he's also thinking about control and prisons and those kinds of structures and trying to embody that in this work. So blocking and bars and structures like that. Oh, and the way they're installed, this is really amazing. This is from a show in 2013, where you can see he's thinking about these paintings in a whole context, which is really cool. And then Sanford Biggers, also contemporary artist, whose work really picks up a lot of these questions of quilt and craft and Black culture in the United States. So he identifies as a painter and a sculptor, but he's using the language of contemporary and these traditional quilts together. So like I love this sort of like quilted piece of fabric that almost looks like spray paint on the wall. And then he's mixing these with paint. Some of these are three-dimensional. They're really gorgeous. I got a chance to see this show a couple of years ago in New York, and it's really quite something. Embroidery on top. So thinking about layers too, you don't have to just sort of make everything all at once. You can make a pattern and then another pattern on top and on top and on top. Really cool. So those are just some examples. You can dig in a lot deeper here to all of these things. I also, oh, sorry, one more thing, I lied. This amazing book on Internet Archive on Encyclopedia of Needlework. There's hundreds, 500 something pages of these drawings of these traditional needlework patterns. So if you get into this, it's totally great. You could, again, imagine, it's pixels. It's the grid. It's the same thing. Super cool. So what are you going to do for your homework? For the first week, I'm asking you to start by doing some research. And in particular, I'd like you to start with this book called Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns by Barbara Brackman. And it's in the readings folder as a PDF. And this book is a masterpiece. It is a collection of drawings she made of thousands of traditional quilt patterns. Each one has a number. They're divided by categories. This is triangles. And what I'd like you to do is look through it and find at least 10 that you like. Now, they don't all have to be from the book. If you also want to go to some of the links down in the bottom, like the Quilt Study Center, and find them there. That's totally cool. But I'd like you to get out of the computer and on some paper, make some drawings, one of each of those patterns. So at least 10, more is great. And I want you to really look, really spend time understanding that pattern, thinking about how it repeats, and then noting where it comes from. So either the source or the pattern name or a number or some way of going back to it. And then once you've done that, oh, and then you're going to make this a detailed drawing. And the idea is that drawing is a way of understanding. It's a way of looking and thinking. You can work digitally or by hand. I think hand is better, but it's up to you. And if you'd like, in the resources folder, I put this graph paper. So you can print it out. It's got a spot for you to list the pattern, if that makes it easier. Then I'd like you to either photograph or scan those. You're going to upload those to Canvas, and then you're going to start prototyping your own quilt. So I'd like you to think about these ideas of iteration, repetition, pattern, and the idea is that you're inspired by the patterns. You don't need to recreate them, but I want you to make your own thing. It does not need to look like a traditional quilt, though it can if that's fun. So start prototyping and making in P5JS, and that's what you're going to turn in for next time. You're going to make some sketches from historical examples, and then start writing your own code. We'll break out and do a feedback session with everybody together. And then for the second week, you're going to finish your quilt, basically. So you're just going to go back in and thinking about all these ideas like color, size, placement, visual rhythm, composition. Those things are all key. Same ideas from painting or drawing apply to making art with code. Code examples are all here, just like before. You can find them in the P5JS editor as a collection, so you can view them, these videos as well, of course. Your deliverables are going to be those 10 drawings and an initial code sketch, then your final version, and you're going to upload those links just like usual. Easy. I'm around for office hours. You can pop in and chat if you have any problems. Some stretch goals. And my voice is giving out, so we're going to stop here pretty soon. Stretch goals. Can you add a decorative border? I think that's pretty easy, something that locks it in. Can you add quilting? Quilting, again, is that decorative stitching. So could you do that with lines on top of your sketch or something like that? And then thinking about this idea of a quilt block. So quilts are made in sections that are then attached together into the bigger quilt. Could you make a function using matrix transformations? Maybe it gets past color arguments or things like that. So you've got some variation, but you're also thinking about it in these like encapsulated pieces of code. Other resources, lots of stuff here to read and research, I think would be great, especially the International Quilt Study Center, like I mentioned. And if you want to read more about quilting in the Black community and Rosie Lee Tompkins, I think that's a fascinating, super cool read, and lots more stuff here. So thinking about iteration, repetition, and the basic drawing stuff that we did last time, I think you're going to make some really cool stuff, and I can't wait to see it.